Welcome to this voiceover presentation for Seminar 6 of the Power Politics and Civil Society module. Essentially what we're going to look at in these slides is an overview of the epistemic community framework and also question the relationship between knowledge, epistemic communities and politics, including the policy process. Essentially what this presentation seeks to do is give you some of the basic debates to give you a way in to the wider reading. You'll see at the end of the presentation slides there's a number of sources of reading that will help to elaborate on the themes that we look at in the presentation. However, for the purposes of the seminar, for Seminar 6, what we're looking to do is to identify some directed reading sources. So we've got 3 reading sources on the Moodle site that I would like students to read in advance of the online discussion board seminar, which will take place on the Friday. Essentially what we're looking to do now, therefore, is to kind of introduce key themes around this area. Just to kind of get started, one of the fundamental themes that kind of drives much of the debate within the areas of knowledge, politics and epistemic communities is the relationship between expertise and public policy. And much of this research has been increasing in its importance and its volume as a result of some of the observations about the nature of societal problems, and that many societal problems are technologically based. They require scientific solutions. There is often a number of points of uncertainty associated with how you actually deal with some complex issues in society. So that almost kind of gives room, if you like, or windows of opportunity, to take a phrase from John Kingdon's work, which is to give them a window of opportunity into the policy process. In a sense, it gives them power to shape the terms of the debate, to shape policy decision making and policy outcomes. And this recognition has also been made in light of what we call the modern society, and that the interdependence between policy issues, policy sectors across multiple levels of governance has increased uncertainty in many ways, and has led to what some call the risk society, where the interdependence between levels of government policy issues are such that actually expert information and expertise is required. We can't just rely on generalist policymakers to make autocratic decisions in the best interests of society. Okay. So uncertainty, and Gronville talks about this, that uncertainty stimulates the need for information and expertise, and Gronville was looking at the issue of the BSE crisis in 1996, and he actually argued that, you know, the technical nature of the policy area requires experts and scientific experts to get involved in the policy process to dampen uncertainty and to suggest policy solutions. However, one of the things that we have to bear in mind is when we talk about what expertise is, you know, that's not necessarily something that is consistently agreed upon. You know, it might be that you have different experts with different opinions. Quite often we might find that the word expert might symbolise something that's better than the generalist, but we can't necessarily presume that all experts agree on all issues at all times, and the BSE crisis in 1996 is a good example of that, thereby different experts had different views on how to deal with BSE as a policy issue. And we see that in a number of different areas, like climate change, for example. We have so-called experts or scientific experts that come from different points of view with regards to the nature of the problem of climate change and ways to deal with it. So we can't necessarily view this word expertise using kind of one definition, if you like. There's a number of forms of expertise, but the question for political scientists is the ways in which this expertise can be defined, and its role within shaping the terms of the political and policy debate. Okay, so expertise more broadly is often used as what we call a legitimating device, and that if experts are drawn into the policy process, policymakers can turn around and say, well, we've actually consulted with the experts. We have evidence, we have expertise that's contributed to this policy. Thereby, it helps to legitimise that policy in the eyes of the public, and it demonstrates that policymakers are opening up the corridors of power in many ways to different expert groups, and it almost kind of legitimises, and it shows that there's an element of a kind of democratic consideration of a number of viewpoints that might actually be allowed to feature in the policy process. Okay. There are issues with regards to the extent to which experts could be said to be held to democratic scrutiny. One of the major debates that we've seen in recent times in the political debate has been with regards to the extent to which technocrats, as we call them, or experts, or those scientists with a kind of scientific background, of course, which also have a bureaucratic role, the extent to which those are subject to democratic scrutiny. So often studies and even media commentary talk about the role of the Brussels bureaucrat, for example, in the European Union, and what often that kind of gets to is this idea that unelected experts, inverted commas, are shaping what we call supranational, which is above the level of the nation state essentially, supranational policy decisions which have an impact across the European Union, and these bureaucrats are often within the European Commission, for example, but the question there that comes from that is, to what extent do we know what these technocrats, experts in the policy areas that they are employed to look at, to what extent are they subject to democratic scrutiny? Is it possible to do that? Okay, so there's questions in the literature about this idea of the scrutiny and democratic scrutiny of experts. Okay, there are also kind of wider debates here in terms of how expertise and information, knowledge, can feature in the policy process, because the literature, as you can see in the slide here in the third bullet, really questions the human ability to actually process evidence, process the outcomes of expertise, and how that can potentially feature in the policy process. It might actually be very difficult to understand what the evidence actually is, particularly if you have experts who have competing interests and have competing ideas. Now, this leads to the wider question about the politicisation of evidence, the extent to which those that provide evidence are political actors or not. The epistemic community framework that we'll come on to look at tries to invoke a sense that those members of an epistemic community aren't really that political, but they exist within a political world. Well, there's debates associated with that, and we'll come on to look at that later in the slideshow. Okay. The wider literature talks about this idea of knowledge and the contestability of knowledge. Benavisti in 1977, really kind of was interested in this area of the contestability of knowledge, and he questioned, what is this idea of knowledge? What is it? How can we define it? Are there conflictual interpretations of what we define as knowledge? It might be that so-called experts, or knowledge, if you like, is there to dampen uncertainties and control situations and to help policymakers resolve uncertainty. But it could be the case that actually this issue of conflict isn't necessarily dampened by expertise. It could be that experts don't all share the same point of view on how a complex situation or complex problem should be managed, and therefore, it's actually for the decision maker to actually weigh up the issues and make a decision. We know from the policy and practice module on the Masters that actually the relationship between evidence, inverted commas, and the policy process is not necessarily a straightforward relationship. It can often have quite a troubled marriage. So therefore, this relates to that debate in that, this issue of knowledge and how it's used and filters through the policy process is something that is of significant interest to political scientists. But at the same time, I think the literature is quite clear that although there are issues, concerns about the role of expertise, what it is, and the influence it has in the policy process, the literature doesn't go as far to say that technical or experts' inputs to the policy process are not required or unimportant as a result of this, because this would be a dangerous line of argument in many ways, because it would basically mean that policymakers would be making decisions blind, if you like. It might be that the policy decisions are evidence informed or knowledge informed, but that's better than having no knowledge at all. However, there are the wider debates associated with the role of political ideology and the nature of power dynamics within the state and the extent to which the government will listen to certain forms of knowledge or interpret knowledge in certain ways. I mean, we know from the expert actors or the scientific public health actors in the area of minimum unit price for alcohol have been very clear that the evidence on the relationship between consumption and affordability of alcohol is there's a direct relationship there, and many within the public health community are suggesting that a minimum unit price for alcohol is something that should be introduced without haste, and the Scottish Government are interested in that. They have a certain political leaning that perhaps allows for that type of policy to come on board, given the fact that it's a quite an interventionist social type of policy approach. However, at the UK level, there's been less of an inclination to take that evidence and translate it into decision making, and perhaps issues to do with ideological interpretations of knowledge and ideological points of view as to the role of the state has an impact on the extent to which that knowledge on something like minimum unit price for alcohol will be implemented at the UK level. So there are these wider issues about political power and the role of ideology and the extent to which evidence and knowledge is taken on board. It is important to remember though that experts can often help to define what a policy issue actually is, or a policy problem actually is, because if we know about the politics of public policy, how the agenda is set and a societal problem is defined often has implications for the rest of the process. So it'll have an implication for the policy options on the table they might look at, the actual decision itself, the range of actors involved and the configuration of actors involved in the policy decision making process. However, expertise and scientists have a key role in aiding policymakers in producing the answers to policy issues, and you'll see that the literature on epistemic communities gathers increasing or a range of important contributions, in that it questions the role of groups of actors, groups of expert actors in coming together to shape policy responses and policy process. A kind of driver for this in more recent times, and well, modern times, has been with regards to Hassey's epistemic community framework, which he applied to environmental policy, particularly in terms of marine protection associated with the Mediterranean. And studies of this have really widened and broadened in the area of environmental policy to look at issues to do with ozone depletion. You'll see from a range of the reading sources the different ways in which the epistemic community has been applied to a range of scientific based policy areas, including things like marine protection, ozone depletion. There's been applications to issues to do with bovine growth hormones and the role of hormones within the trade and regulation of animal products. So these scientific-based approaches have been applied as well. But there's been wider roles of the epistemic community framework as well within Europe, if we think about the issue to do with minority rights. And you'll see that from the Galbraith and McAvoy reading, that it's not just necessarily specifically about environmental policy issues that the epistemic community framework has been applied, but what we've found is the kind of key driver, if you like, or the key driving force behind the proliferation of studies looking at epistemic communities has came from the environmental policy side of things. But you know, in terms of, there's kind of wider questions, the extent to which Haas's work has been particularly groundbreaking, because you know, there were kind of other developments in the literature at the time, and Dunlop kind of talks about the wider renaissance in the kind of, you know, the 1980s into the early 1990s with regards to the role of knowledge in the policy process, and that has really taken hold in other conceptual frameworks such as Paul Sabatier's advocacy coalition framework, which isn't the focus of this discussion, but it's important to understand that the advocacy coalition framework is another way to think about the translation of knowledge and the role of coalitions of knowledge in featuring in the policy process. However, for the purposes of this seminar, we'll be focusing mainly on the epistemic community framework. So, what constitutes an epistemic community? Peter Haas discusses the issue of epistemic communities, and there's an article for your reading on this. But he defines epistemic community as a network of professionals with recognised expertise and competence in a particular policy domain, and have an authoritative knowledge, or sorry, an authoritative claim to policy relevant knowledge. In other words, they have significant expertise, but they're grouped around networks. So networks of actors are very important here. So if you're a member of an epistemic community, you're a professional with a key expertise in a certain policy area, but you're part of a network, a tight network. And essentially, they have a range of shared policy beliefs on what should happen within a policy area. So they have similar goals and similar aims. Okay. There are quite exclusionists in some senses. If you don't agree with a policy aim or a policy goal that kind of structures the epistemic community, then you will be excluded from the process, or you'll be excluded. So it might be the case that, say for example, those groups of experts working within climate change could represent an epistemic community if they share the same policy goal or the same policy view and belief, that for example there's a direct relationship between growth, capitalist growth, and climate change. So that would be a belief and a value, and it might be that that structures and makes that network of actors solidified in many ways. However, these epistemic communities might actually be called upon by policymakers to advise, particularly in areas of uncertainty, to help allow policymakers take an informed decision on the policy process. Haas also talks about the transnational aspects of these groups, and that the members of the groups aren't necessarily drawn from one state context. They might actually be brought together from a range of state contexts, but participate in forums that actually allows them to translate and network and draw their knowledge together. And we've seen from studies of European politics that this can often take place in things like European committees, European technical policy committees, whereby they come together to discuss policy areas. However, there are certain elements, if you like, key elements that or features, if you like, of epistemic communities. So one is that they have a shared set of normative and political beliefs which provide a value-based rationale for the social action of community members. The second is that they have shared causal beliefs which are derived from their practices leading or contributing to a central set of problems in their domain, and which they serve as the basis of elucidating the multiple linkages between possible policy actions and desired outcomes. The third is that they have shared notions of validity. So that is, they have intersubjective, internally defined criteria for weighing and validating knowledge in the domain of their expertise. So they have consistent approaches, consistent beliefs with regards to how you actually weigh up issues and calculate the risks associated with policy issues. And fourthly, they have a common policy enterprise. So there's a common set of practices associated with a set of problems to which their professional competence is directed. So basically, it'll be as a result of a conviction of what they're able to contribute. So it might be that they have a conviction that human welfare will be enhanced, or there'll be social development, economic development. There'll be a contribution to be made to society. They will have a common interest in this. They'll have a common belief in this. So in terms of the emergence of epistemic communities, Haas argues that there's various factors, if you like, that contribute to the emergence of epistemic communities, and this can range from issues to do with uncertainty and the extent to which epistemic communities are able to be institutionalised in the policy-making process. In other words, the extent to which they have access to bureaucracies and the corridors of power, if you like. Okay. There are other issues here with regards to the nature of complex issues, as we've said at the beginning of the presentation. Epistemic communities will emerge when there's uncertainty, when policymakers require policy solutions. The wider context here is that epistemic communities can be quite powerful and influential, and many times there's strength in numbers associated with the members of epistemic communities, because bearing in mind that the members of epistemic communities often come from respected scientific backgrounds whereby they are accountable to their own profession, but within that profession they're highly respected. And if you're working with a constellation of actors that are of a similar background and a similar nature, the question is, how does that give you a powerful basis? Does that give you an influential role in the policy process? Okay. It might be that a crisis situation provides the window of opportunity for that group of actors to come together to shape the terms of the debate. Okay. So, for example, if we say something like the issue to do with avian influenza or avian flu, which has really taken off in the past 15 years as a risk to human welfare, given the potential, the H5N1 virus, or avian flu, the extent to which that can mutate to basically infect the general public, and the human-to-human transfer of flu could emerge as a result of the mutation of H5N1. That's been something that's really taken off in recent years, and it's been a concern for international policy actors in the European Union, even at national level as well. It's been a concern, and the question therefore is, how do we understand the patterns of H5N1? What can we do as crisis managers, so policymakers being crisis managers? To what extent can they actually try and understand that policy issue, and what are the best ways to deal with that policy issue? How do we contain it? How do we implement contingency plans to avoid further uncertainty? Those issues, those questions, those types of uncertainties are really the ground from which epistemic communities can actually build their influence, because they are the ones that often have the scientific knowledge that becomes important for dealing with that type of policy issue. What are the ways in which they can exert influence? Adler and Haas talk about the ways in which epistemic communities can exert influence on policymakers in four main ways. Firstly, in terms of policy innovation, so it's how they frame the policy issue that can actually have implications for the rest of the policy process. So the innovation approach is important here. Secondly, there's policy diffusion. This basically means that given the fact there's transnational links between members of an epistemic community, they're able to make their views known quite easily. We've identified in the slide here that also policy selection is important here, because what you'll find is that epistemic communities will actually present a number of choices, but at the same time policymakers are actually providing the options from which policymakers make the decision. So that is a very powerful aspect, I feel like, to an epistemic community, and that they're actually shaping the decision making process. Policy persistence is important as well, in that given the fact that networks have different levels of maturity, if you're a mature epistemic community and you have the persistence of beliefs that have solidified over a period of time, this can actually become a very influential body or network that can have an impact on authority. But given the fact that we've said earlier that these scientific experts have a range of shared knowledge, shared ideas, shared beliefs, and if that is built up as a relationship within the network over time, it can become very influential. Also, there's a learning dimension to this. Adler and Haas talk about the process of learning, and that it basically means that as policymakers try to learn about policy issues and to implement policy issues over time, epistemic communities are there in shaping that learning. They're there with policymakers and actually shaping the terms of learning over time and the terms of the debate. Okay. What are the ways and what are the levels or the arenas in which epistemic communities can become influential? Well, Adler and Haas argue that epistemic communities are able to erase the artificial boundaries between international and domestic politics. So this is perhaps the reason why the concept has been quite heavily applied to the European Union context, because in the European Union, the way we understand it is that the European Union is characterised by multi-level governance. There's the role of the domestic, the national level, in shaping the terms of the European debate, but at the same time what you have is a set of European institutions that can also be the policy initiator, and the decisions that take place at the European level can filter down to the domestic levels. So what we describe the European Union as is a form of multi-level governance, but epistemic communities are able to transcend those levels of governance and almost kind of blur the boundaries between those levels, given the fact they're quite fluid and they're able to operate at the domestic level as well as the international level. Okay. However, there are questions here, because Haas does suggest that research into the role of epistemic communities should actually take place at the domestic level as well as the international level, and that we should understand how domestic actors or domestic epistemic communities have a role within the state context. To what extent do they have access to the bureaucracy at the national level? How influential are they? Do they have insider status? It's these types of questions that epistemic communities or studies of epistemic communities are interested in. This issue of influence becomes ever more important, because access to decision makers is something that is key for an epistemic community to be influential. This relates to this issue of what we call bureaucratic insinuation. So Wynne Grant, in his studies of pressure groups and stakeholder groups, discusses the issue of insider status. Epistemic communities will tend to have insider status in that they become actors, if you like, within the bureaucratic context. Haas has also argued that epistemic communities need to keep rivals at bay, because in a democratic society there's a number of stakeholders and a number of actors that will want to have representation in the bureaucracy to shape decision making. Haas was quite unclear about who these rivals actually are. However, Claire Dunlop's work indicates that these rivals in some senses could be other interest groups or other groups that could be defined as epistemic communities. So if you're a strong epistemic community with a shared belief, you want to maintain that belief and want to influence as much as possible. So there might be an element of conflict involved in ensuring that you maintain your insider position as much as possible, and as Haas argues, keep rivals at bay. If you keep rivals at bay, that means that you're maintaining your influence. So there is an element of self-interest here associated with the role of epistemic communities. Okay. Adler and Adler and Harsey's work in this area of epistemic communities discuss this issue of maintaining influence within the bureaucracy. And there's a number of case studies within the 1992 edition of International Organisation Journal, which is actually the journal article that you'll be looking at, or well, the Haas article that you'll be looking at comes from that journal, from that edition of the journal. And you can go back and look at the wider readings within that volume. But we can see from Adler's study of arms control that he provides a note of caution and warns against overemphasising the importance of insider status. So he outlines that the effectiveness of the US arms control epistemic community was highly dependent upon its autonomy from the political sphere. So it was actually mattered quite heavily that the epistemic community wasn't seen as a political actor in itself. That there was a balance between insider and outsider status. So if you were kind of on the fence, if you like, on the margin, that would actually enhance your influence in many ways. So the epistemic community in this example was balanced by its outside contact with research organisations, universities and think tanks. It wasn't seen as a purely insider network that was heavily closely related to government alone, because then what happens is, do you become a compromised epistemic community given your level of insider status? Does it mean that your lack of contact with other groups, does that diminish your definition, if you like, of an epistemic community? Because there is this wider debate about the politicisation of evidence. Are so-called technocrats political actors? Well, epistemic communities are trying to avoid that. They're trying to ensure that they have that level of autonomy in many ways from the bureaucracy. But there's that balance to be struck because they still want to have influence. So there needs to be an element of insider status, but balanced out with its outsider contacts. Transnational networking and diffusion are important. So this basically involves an epistemic community at the nation-state level networking with other states. So this means that a favoured epistemic community in itself joins together with others to diffuse their ideas transnationally in an attempt to reach transnational policymakers. And what you'll often find is that epistemic communities will try to participate in the work of international organisations. We talked about international organisations earlier in the module, but what we're talking about here are forums like the United Nations, the European Union, where there can be opportunities to gather collective agreement over policy action. And quite often, if you maintain cooperation or secure cooperation at the international level, then that will have implications for levels of the nation states, because these policy initiatives and policy decisions will filter down to the national level. So this idea of coalition building is very important, linking together to influence governments. This issue of knowledge diffusion helps with this process in securing partnerships between groups of actors. So the idea of the insider epistemic community can help to drive transnational cooperation and facilitate policy coordination. So at the international level, this has gathered great importance within the literature. You'll see from, as I say, the reading list and from the reading that you've got for the seminar, that studies of the European Union have considered the role of epistemic communities quite significantly, ranging from Brine's work to Zito's work to Dunlop's work, Galbraith and McAvoy. They've all looked at this issue of epistemic communities and have tried to apply Haas's framework to different policy areas. The question, therefore, that many of these studies focus on is the extent to which epistemic communities can be seen as political actors. So Haas contended that epistemic communities do not participate in the political world. So he made the case that political factors have a constraining role on the application of the epistemic community framework, which limits the application of consensual views of the specialists that exist within these networks. However, there are issues associated with this, in that although the state has a significant degree of control in many respects over policy making, the extent to which they can be regarded as sitting outside of the political world can be questioned in many ways. Litvin, for example, in the study of ozone discourses and environmental policy, argued that knowledge itself is inseparable from power, even in pure science. So it's this idea that if you're a knowledge network, a knowledge broker, or part of a group of expert actors that could be defined as an epistemic community, to what extent can you be purely regarded as an expert group, given the fact you work within a public policy domain? This idea is based on some of Litvin's arguments, and also if you look at some of Verdon's work, that considers that actually the information that features in the policy process has to be context aware, and it's interpreted in a certain way to fit within that policy context at that given time. So the question is, to what extent can you just take textbook information and textbook knowledge and plant it within the policy decision making process? There has to be a process of filtering the knowledge, making the knowledge contextual and appropriate for that policy context. So that leads to questions about the politics of knowledge transfer and the extent to which knowledge is separate from this process of policy decision making and the wider politics. So the epistemic community does have its critics, and it has been subject to a number of criticisms. Susskind, for example, has argued that national governments will never allow an expert community to depart from domestic political considerations about a country's interests. Okay, so it's this idea that, to what extent can states just keep experts at arm's length when they're supposed to be influential within the policy process? But to what extent, will they have insider status, and will they be influential if they don't couch their expertise within the interests of the state? Sabati, for example, indicates that an epistemic community may have to deal with closely held beliefs or policy styles that exist within particular countries. So they have to be adaptable in basically suiting the policy context and political environment of different states. Wright, for example, contends that the complexity of the epistemic community concept leads to a situation whereby it's difficult to actually identify who these communities actually are, although many studies have tried to apply the framework to different contexts. It may be the case that competing epistemic communities may seek to take over the bureaucracies of government in order to promote their preferred knowledge scheme, consequently resulting in an epistemic community capturing the bureaucracy and taking control over a particular policy area. Now that's something that is debatable. However, if you take it to its logical conclusions, then the question therefore is, if the epistemic community wants to influence policy coordination, then do they become the political actor? But at the same time, Haas is trying to argue that they are not existing within a political world. How do we reconcile those issues? Litvin goes further to say, well, are we just talking about bureaucratic politics here? If they're trying to usurp decision-making channels, then doesn't that just mean that epistemic communities are going to be in conflict with a range of other actors in the policy process, and actually they're not necessarily any more influential than other stakeholder groups? Ernst Haas, who is Peter Haas's father, actually, in his text, warns against regarding epistemic communities as the white knights of expertise, arrayed against the forces of darkness. Perhaps he doesn't bear this in mind as his own argument at times. However, Toke documents one of the most fundamental criticisms of the epistemic community framework, which it doesn't take into account the role of other actors. The roles of other non-epistemic community actors and the relationships to the epistemic community itself are left unaddressed by the concept. So the networks that exist outside the epistemic community network, and the configuration of those and the influence of those are perhaps not addressed as fully as some academics would like. The definition itself of an epistemic community could be said to suffer from rigidity, and that it could be argued that the concept should assume greater elasticity in its structure, and to acknowledge the reality of the competition between different epistemic communities and interest groups, and the knowledge that actually in a democratic society and within civil society there are a number of organisations and groups that have an interest in public policy. Epistemic community framework could actually acknowledge that a bit further, and Dunlop has done some interesting work in this area in terms of scrutinising the nature of epistemic communities. I would suggest that you take some time to look at these. They might actually help you elaborate on some of the themes that we'll discuss at the discussion at the seminar on Friday via the discussion board. However, please focus your reading for now around the 3 articles that have been identified on the Moodle site, and that could be your basis of doing some wider reading. On the material, this wider reading includes a number of journal articles that are accessible via the library's